According to statistics, the income of Vietnamese workers is $300 per month in the first quarter of 2024. Many of these people also do not have $40,000 to deposit in the bank. In fact, they have never seen $40,000 in cash in their entire lives. With current expenses, a basic family with 2 parents and 2 children, covering all costs including rent, food, coffee, medical care, and education, would save about $80 per month. To escape poverty and reach $40,000, you would decide to save and let the interest compound. With an annual interest rate of 6% after 21 years, your family would achieve the goal. But by then, you would be over 50-60 years old, which seems quite late, right? Today, I will tell you about a 67-year-old woman who has assets equivalent to 445,000 Vietnamese households, or 445,000 trillion VND. Remarkably, she only needed 4 years to accumulate this amount. Yes, she is Truong My Lan, who has been prosecuted by the investigative agency for embezzling $18 billion. This amount is so large that an average person cannot even conceive of it. If converted to 100 bills, this sum would weigh 180 tons and require 8 container trucks for transportation. This amount is equivalent to the total assets of the 9 richest people in the Vietnamese stock market combined. It also represents 3.7% of Vietnam's GDP in 2023. In global terms, she would rank 77th richest in the world. I must emphasize that this is illicit money obtained through embezzlement. But a single individual within the group managed to manipulate such a vast amount of money. So where did this money come from? How was it acquired? Where did it go? If you want to see the details of how this happened, this video is for you. But before we start, remember to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos. In 1986, Truong My Lan, then known as Truong Moi, was selling fabric at Ben Thanh Market. Her husband, Chu Lap Ko, was a Hong Kong-born real estate entrepreneur. With a sharp business mind, in 1992, she founded Van Thien Phat LLC, which operated in the fields of trade and restaurant and hotel business. By 2007, the company expanded into real estate. After developing, she and her husband built a conglomerate with many subsidiaries, acquiring numerous prime locations in Saigon, such as Union Square and Times Square. As you know, completing a real estate project requires a lot of capital, from hundreds to thousands of trillion VND over a long period. Especially if you are in the hotel business, you need even more capital. Mrs. Lan had to solve the capital problem for the group, seeking how to obtain more capital, especially low-cost, long-term capital with the best conditions in the market. At that time, she looked towards the source of capital for the entire economy, the banking sector. Banks operate essentially as capital businesses. What is capital business? They borrow money from the public and then lend that money to other businesses and individuals at higher interest rates. Specifically, when you have some idle money and don't know what to do with it, the first thing you think of is depositing it in the bank. Each year, the bank will pay you interest of around 6%. For example, if you deposit $40,000, you will receive $4,200. The $2,400 doesn't just appear in the bank, but is generated through lending. The bank lends to businesses or individuals for production, buying houses or cars at 9 to 10% interest, and the bank earns the difference of 3 to 4%. It might seem that banks have an easy business, but in reality, managing such large amounts of money involves significant risk management. Banks must adhere to principles set by the state bank, such as not lending too much to one company, as a company's bankruptcy would lead to the bank's bankruptcy as well. They should not lend excessively in one sector, such as real estate, because if real estate freezes, the bank will face danger too. Therefore, diversification and careful customer assessment for repayment capability and collateral are crucial. As you may know, when borrowing, you usually need to secure it with land, a red book, or the company's machinery and equipment, and you have to go through many procedures. If you have bad credit or inadequate asset valuation, you may not even be able to borrow. At that time, Truong My Lan thought, why should we borrow from banks with such strict, complex, and cumbersome procedures? Why should we let the bank earn a 3 to 4% spread between deposit and loan interest rates? Why not own a bank ourselves? and the opportunity came. More than 10 years ago, around 2010 to 2012, when the economy was struggling to recover from the 2008 global financial crisis, many banks were struggling with poor performance and were under control and restructuring. Truong Lan saw her chance. She used her money to acquire 3 banks: 81% of Saigon Commercial Joint Stock Bank, formerly 98% of Vietnam Tinh Nha Commercial Joint Stock Bank, 80% of Dai Nhat Commercial Joint Stock Bank, and merged these banks into SCB, Saigon Joint Stock Commercial Bank. To avoid government scrutiny, Mrs. Lan hired 92 nominal shareholders to hold shares in the bank because, according to the law, if you hold 5% of a company's shares, you are considered a major shareholder. Major shareholders must report to the state bank and the Securities Commission with each transaction. Lan always wanted to stay as hidden as possible to avoid detection of her illicit activities. After merging the 3 banks to raise funds, SCB kept deposit interest rates high to attract public deposits. However, because the state bank controls these rates, SCB could not increase them arbitrarily. So Mrs. Lan came up with a second way to raise funds, establishing Tan Viet Securities Joint Stock Company and Viet Vinh Phu Financial Investment Joint Stock Company to raise funds from the stock market. Through selling securities, bonds to investors, advising on bonds, advising on privatization, and IPOs for companies in the Van Thinh Phat Group. But the most important part was selling bonds to companies within the group. By acquiring banks and setting up financial and securities companies, Mrs. Lan had a massive source of capital. SCB alone raised 600,000 trillion VN Dien from the public. With so much money, how to withdraw it without being noticed or detected? Ordinary people like us might not be able to answer this question, but Mrs. Lan did. Specifically, she set up many backdoor companies with very clear tasks. These backdoor companies are divided into 3 groups. Group 1, companies operating in Vietnam with assets in real estate, restaurants, food, and tourism sectors. Group 2, front companies, companies with no real business activity, only used to hold real estate, hotels, and projects to avoid attention and reporting. Group 3, overseas companies, companies managing assets, often based in tax havens like the British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Panama, and managed by Mrs. Lan's husband, Chu Lap Co. With the system of companies in place, how to withdraw money from the bank, which is tightly regulated by law. Mrs. Lan used the companies from Groups 1 and 2 as clients, bribed valuation organizations, inflated asset values, and created documents to comply with legal requirements to mislead regulatory agencies. Companies traded assets among themselves, not concerned with the actual state, as long as the documents met the bank's requirements. A notable point was the disbursement process. Normally, when borrowing, money is disbursed after approval. But at SCB, money was given out first and documentation was processed afterward. Loans from Van Thinh Phat were marked with the code HSTT, meaning Marketing Office. When a document with HSTT was seen, SCB would immediately approve and disperse the loan, bypassing the usual process. Later, asset and loan assessments were conducted. If documents were incomplete or did not meet conditions, efforts were made to make them sufficient. SCB disbursed over 2,500 loans, including more than 1,000 personal clients and 1,400 corporate clients, with a total amount exceeding $41.67 billion involving Mrs. Truong Lan and her accomplices. By October 2022, when Truong Lan was temporarily detained, there were still 875 clients with over 1,000 loans. The total outstanding debt was $28.21 billion, and the principal debt of these loans accounted for 93% of SCB's total principal debt. This means that out of every $100 lent by the bank, $93 went to Mrs. Lan's subsidiaries, and this $93 was all classified as bad debt level 5, the worst level. To hide this bad debt, Mrs. Truong Lan instructed selling the bad debt to the asset management company, VAMC, and selling deferred debt to ghost companies set up by the Van Thinh Phat Group. One question is, if this $93 cannot be recovered or repaid, where will the bank find capital to continue lending? After some deliberation with key members of the group, Mrs. Lan chose 4 companies to issue, advise, and sell illegal corporate bonds, raising money from the public to pay off debts. Alternatively, creating fake land numbers to lure investors or the public into buying overpriced land without knowing. In this way, many valuable assets were transferred to foreign companies, i.e. companies in Group 3. With such a vast amount of illicit money withdrawn from SCB, how to convert it into clean money? Ms. Lan used a very traditional method, withdrawing cash from accounts and distributing it to various contacts to avoid detection, since bank transfers would leave a traceable history. Cash transactions, once withdrawn, cannot be traced. These contacts then used the money to buy assets from the Van Think Phat Group's subsidiary companies, deposited in savings accounts, or purchase assets abroad. According to Ms. Lan's driver, Bui Van Dung, he transported $4.5 billion from SCB to the Van Think Phat Group. From there, the money was moved to various locations and used to buy assets abroad, such as the Esso Singapore Hotel and the Robinson Point Tower office building in Singapore, at exorbitant prices. If Ms. Lan conducted such operations, where were the government and auditors? It's simple. There were inspectors, but even they could not resist the lure of money. By 2017, SCB's financial situation was dire, with significant negative equity. Thus, the government auditors were proposed to oversee the situation. When they conducted the inspection, they did find many issues, but with $5 million slipped into the hands of the head auditor, resistance was difficult. In reality, while it's easy for outsiders to criticize and condemn corruption, it's likely that many would also struggle to remain incorruptible in such circumstances. When offered a large sum to blur reports, not to completely alter them, but just to obscure certain details, who could honestly claim they would refuse? If you think you could, leave a comment below. Afterwards, the inspection team and the former head of the audit department, Do Thi Nhan, were arrested. The case of Truong My Lan and the Van Think Phat Group is still ongoing, having reached the second phase and remaining unresolved due to its scale and complexity. This case underscores the Vietnamese government's determination to combat corruption both within and outside the government, especially within the auditing and inspection sectors. It also serves as a warning to companies manipulating financial institutions. Thank you for watching the video. If you found it interesting and useful, please like and subscribe to the channel. Now, goodbye, and see you in the next videos.